The roar of the Persian Empire echoed across the world. From India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces were under the rule of one man, Ahasuerus, king of Persia. His palace in Susa was a monument to his greatness. But in his court, a conspiracy was brewing, a plan of extermination, a decree that would condemn an entire people to death. And in the shadow of danger, God had already placed a woman on the throne. The grand banquet of King Ahasuerus, luxury and opulence. Esther walking through the palace halls, her gaze filled with uncertainty. The royal seal falling on the decree to exterminate the Jews. Mordecai in the streets, tearing his clothes and crying out in desperation. Haman in the court, with a dark smile, convincing the king to destroy the Hebrew people. Esther trembling before the doors of the royal hall, knowing that entering unsummoned could mean her death. The great dinner with the king and Haman, where the fate of a nation would be decided. Haman's face turning to terror as his own destiny is sealed. It is the story of a woman called for a time of crisis. A woman who faced fear and risked her life for her people. The fate of a nation depended on a decision: to speak or to remain silent, to live or to die. The enemy had sealed their plan, but God had already prepared the victory. How did an orphan become a queen? How did betrayal nearly destroy an entire people? How did an invisible God change the course of history? This is not just an ancient tale. It is a message for our times. For such a time, you were called. Book of Esther, the movie. It was the third year of the reign of Ahasuerus. From India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces were under his rule. The king of Persia was a man of boundless greatness. But that greatness was not enough for him. He wanted to display his power to the world. And so, he held a banquet, a feast like none had ever seen. For 180 days, princes and nobles of the empire enjoyed the king's luxuries. And at the end, the banquet was open to all. Wine flowed without restriction. Golden goblets gleamed under the light of the chandeliers. The palace gardens were filled with music and laughter. And in the midst of it all, King Ahasuerus was drunk with glory and wine. Then he said,
"Bring Queen Vashti. Let everyone behold her beauty."
But Vashti did not come. She refused, and in an instant, the king's pride was wounded. The laughter faded. Silence fell over the hall. Ahasuerus could not allow it. If his own queen disobeyed him, what would stop all the women of the kingdom from doing the same? At that moment, the royal advisor spoke.
"O king, if Vashti is not punished, women will despise their husbands. Decree that she never again come into your presence, and let her position be given to another better than her."
And so it was. Queen Vashti was banished, but the king soon regretted his decision. For though he had power over the world, he had no queen. The advisors proposed a plan.
"Let the most beautiful maidens in all the kingdom be sought. Let them be brought to the palace, and from among them, the king will choose a new queen."
And so, an edict was sent. The king's officers traveled to every province, every city, every village, searching for the woman who would occupy the throne of Persia. And among the young women, there was one whose destiny had been sealed before her birth, a young orphan, but called by God. In the city of Susa lived a young Hebrew woman named Hadassah, orphaned of father and mother, raised by her cousin Mordecai, a righteous man who feared God. When the king's officers arrived, Hadassah was taken to the palace, separated from her family, taken to a world she did not know. But Mordecai gave her one final instruction.
Do not reveal your origin. Do not say you are a Hebrew. Keep silent until the time comes.
Then Hadassah was taken to the palace, and she changed her name to Esther to hide her true identity. Once in the palace, the maidens were prepared. For 12 months they received perfumes and ointments. But Esther was different. From the first day, she found favor with Haggai, the guardian of the harem. She received the best treatments, the finest garments. And when the day came to present herself before the king, she asked for nothing special. She simply appeared as she was. And as soon as Ahasuerus saw her, the destiny of Persia changed forever. The king loved her more than all the others. And on that very day, he placed the royal crown on her head. Esther, the orphan, the foreigner, became the queen of Persia. But neither she nor the king knew that God had placed her on that throne for a much greater mission. For darkness was approaching, and very soon, an enemy would rise to destroy her entire people. Esther had been crowned queen of Persia. An entire people celebrated in the streets. King Ahasuerus held a banquet in her honor. The Hebrew orphan now wore the crown of the greatest empire in the world. But outside the palace walls, in the streets of Susa, shadows began to stir. Mordecai, Esther's cousin, worked at the palace gate. One day, he overheard two voices whispering in the darkness. It was two officers conspiring.
The king trusts us, but his reign has lasted too long. It is time to put an end to it.
It was a plot against Ahasuerus, a plan to assassinate the king. Mordecai acted immediately. He ran to the court, sent a message to Esther, and through her, the king was warned. The traitors were captured, interrogated, and finally executed. Mordecai's deed was recorded in the royal chronicles, but the king forgot about it. Years passed, and though Mordecai had saved Ahasuerus' life, he received no reward. But soon, God would use that small act to change history. Meanwhile, a man was rising to power, a man who would become the greatest threat to God's people. His name was Haman, son of Hammedatha, an Agagite, an enemy of the Hebrews since ancient times. The king exalted him above all the princes of the realm, and with his newfound power, Haman demanded something more, that everyone bow before him. At the palace gate, everyone bowed, everyone except one. Mordecai remained standing, his back straight, his gaze firm, and when asked why, he replied simply,
I am a Jew. I do not bow to any man.
The words reached Haman's ears, and his heart filled with fury. But killing only Mordecai was not enough. Haman wanted to exterminate all the Jews. So Haman went before the king with poisonous words.
O King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered among all your provinces. Their laws are different. They do not obey your decrees. It is not fitting for them to remain in your kingdom. If it pleases you, issue an edict to destroy them, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury.
The king asked no questions. He did not investigate. Simply, he took his royal ring, and with its seal, he signed the death sentence. A decree was sent to every province, quickly, sealed with the king's authority. Messengers rode throughout the empire. The orders were clear. On the 13th day of the month of Adar, all Jews, young and old, men and women, will be exterminated. The fate of an entire people had been sealed. When Mordecai heard the decree, he tore his clothes, covered himself in sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the streets of Susa, crying out loudly. From every city and province, the weeping of the Jews rose to the heavens. But in the palace, Esther knew nothing until her maids saw Mordecai in the streets and sent her a message.
Queen Esther, your cousin Mordecai is at the palace gate, dressed in mourning. He cries and weeps without ceasing.
Esther sent one of her servants to ask him what was happening. Mordecai responded with a message.
The people are condemned. The king has signed their extermination. Esther, you must go before the king and plead for your people.
Esther's heart pounded, because what Mordecai was asking was impossible.
Everyone knows that no one can enter the king's presence without being summoned. Whoever does so will die, unless the king extends his golden scepter. And I have not been called before the king in 30 days.
Mordecai sent one final message, one that shook Esther's soul.
Do not think that you will escape because you are in the palace. If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows if for such a time as this, you were brought to the kingdom.
Esther fell silent. Those words pierced her heart. It was true. She had been brought to the palace. She had found favor with the king. She had been crowned queen. But perhaps not by chance.
Go and gather all the Jews of Susa. Fast for me for 3 days and 3 nights. I and my maids will do the same. And then I will go into the king's presence, even though I have not been summoned. And if I perish, I perish.
The decision had been made. Esther was ready. Now, she was heading to face her destiny. 3 days had passed. 3 days of fasting. 3 days of prayer. 3 days where Esther prepared her heart and said goodbye to her life. Because now, she was walking toward death. The great throne room was illuminated with golden lamps. King Ahasuerus sat on his throne of ivory and silver. The guards watched every detail. No one could enter without being summoned. No one could approach the king without permission. The punishment was death. And then, the doors of the hall opened. Esther stepped forward with slow steps. Each step was a sentence. The courtiers watched in horror, because they knew what happened to those who defied the law. The king looked up and saw her, radiant, dressed in her royal robe, beautiful, but with a face marked by fasting. For a moment, the silence felt eternal. Esther did not look away. She did not tremble. And in that moment, the fate of an entire people hung on a single gesture, the golden scepter, or the sentence of death. The king looked at Esther, and something in him was moved. Then, he extended his golden scepter. The entire room exhaled. Esther would live.
What troubles you, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you.
If I have found favor in your sight, I come to invite you to a banquet. You and Haman.
The king smiled. A royal banquet, a moment of celebration, and beside him, the most powerful man in the kingdom, Haman. When Haman received the invitation, his pride swelled. Haman was elated. He had been invited to a private banquet with the king and queen. But as he left the palace, his joy faded, because at the gate was Mordecai, and Mordecai did not bow to him. Haman entered his house furious. He slammed the table. He looked at his advisors and his wife, Zeresh.
None of this satisfies me, as long as that Jew Mordecai remains alive.
Then, kill him. Have a gallows built, 25 meters high. Ask the king for permission to hang Mordecai on it, and tomorrow, celebrate it at the banquet.
Haman loved the idea. That very night, he ordered the gallows to be built. Tomorrow, Mordecai would die. But what Haman did not know was that while he was plotting his revenge, God was already writing his downfall. That night, the king could not sleep. He tossed and turned in his royal bed. Peace had abandoned him. And so, he summoned his scribes.
Bring me the book of records, so that I may read it.
Scribes began to read, and then they came to a forgotten account. The day Mordecai saved the king's life by uncovering the conspiracy of the treacherous officers. The king straightened on his throne. He looked at the scribes.
What honor was given to Mordecai for this?
None, O king.
The king frowned, and at that moment, the footsteps of a man approached the palace. Haman had just arrived. He came with a request in mind, the death of Mordecai. But what he would receive would be his own humiliation. The king summoned Haman.
Haman, what should be done for the man the king wishes to honor?
Haman's heart swelled with pride, because he thought, surely the king wants to honor me. So he responded with grandiosity.
O king, let the man be dressed in royal robes. Let him ride the king's horse. Let a crown be placed on his head. And let the most noble prince lead him through the streets proclaiming, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor."
The king smiled and said,
Excellent idea, Haman. Go now and do this for Mordecai, the Jew. Do not omit anything you have said.
There was absolute silence. Haman's blood ran cold. His world crumbled. But he had no choice. That very morning, with a face pale from rage and shame, Haman dressed Mordecai in royal robes. He mounted him on the king's horse and led him through the streets of Susa, proclaiming. The crowd watched in amazement. Mordecai, the man Haman wanted to hang on a gallows, was now exalted. But Haman had no time to lament, because that night, a banquet awaited him. A banquet that would change his destiny forever. Haman's destiny was teetering. His plan to kill Mordecai had failed. The man he despised had been exalted by the king himself. But he still had one hope left, the queen's banquet. That night, everything could change. The king and Haman arrived at the private banquet. The table was set with the finest delicacies of Persia. Wine flowed in golden goblets. But though the atmosphere was festive, Haman's heart was uneasy, because he knew something was not right. And then the king spoke.
Queen Esther, what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you.
Esther took a deep breath. This was the moment. Her entire people depended on her words.
If I have found favor in your sight, if it pleases you to grant my life, save me and my people, for we have been sold, to be destroyed, to be annihilated. If we had only been sold as slaves, I would have remained silent. But I cannot stay silent when death looms over us.
There was silence in the hall. The king's face hardened. His hands gripped the edges of the table. His voice roared with fury.
Who is the man who has done this? Who has dared to lay his hand on my queen?
Esther turned slowly, her eyes fixed on Haman, and with a voice that echoed through the room, she said,
The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman.
Haman's face turned pale. The air seemed to vanish from the room. Fear ran down his spine, because he realized he had been exposed.
Haman, do you dare to conspire against my queen here in my own house?
The king rose in anger and stormed into the garden. Haman collapsed to his knees. His arrogance had vanished. Now he begged for his life. He clung to Esther's feet.
Queen, don't let them kill me, please!
But at that moment, the king returned to the hall, and when he saw Haman clinging to Esther, his fury exploded.
And now, do you also dare to assault the queen in my presence?
Haman's fate was sealed in that instant. The guards covered his face, because in Persia, when a man's face was covered, it meant he was condemned to death. Then, one of the king's eunuchs spoke.
O king, Haman has built a gallows 25 meters high to hang Mordecai there, the same Mordecai who saved the king's life.
The king frowned, and with a cold, firm voice he decreed,
Hang Haman on the gallows he himself prepared. Deserves to die.
The guards seized Haman. They dragged him out of the palace, and there, on the gallows he had built for Mordecai, Haman was hanged. Thus ended the man who dared to defy God's people. But the battle was not yet over. Though Haman was dead, the king's decree still stood. In a few months, the enemies of the Jews would rise against them, and on the appointed day, the extermination would begin. Esther risked her life once more. She appeared before the king again, and with tears in her eyes, she pleaded,
If I have found favor in your sight, revoke Haman's edict. Do not let my people perish.
The king could not annul a royal decree, but he could issue a new one that would change history forever.
Hear my word. From this day, the Jews shall have the right to defend themselves. They may take up arms. They may fight against their enemies. And anyone who tries to harm them shall be destroyed.
The message was sent to every province, from India to Ethiopia. The Jews rose up with courage, and when the appointed day came, the enemies of the Jews, originally incited by Haman, attacked them, but the Jews defended themselves and prevailed. In the capital, Susa, the battle lasted 2 days. The Jews killed 75,000 enemies across the empire, including Haman's 10 sons, who were publicly hanged. Their enemies were defeated. There was no looting or excessive vengeance. The Jews acted only in self-defense. God's people prevailed. The curse that Haman had pronounced turned against his own followers, and throughout the land, the Jews celebrated the great victory. They had light and gladness, joy and honor. Mordecai was exalted. He became second only to the king. Together with Esther, they decreed that this day would be celebrated forever, a festival of joy, a reminder of how God saved his people. Since then, every year in the month of Adar, The Jews celebrate Purim, the day when death turned into life and sorrow into joy. Because though God's name was never mentioned in this story, his hand was always guiding the destiny.
Thank you for joining us in this incredible story. The story of Esther is proof that, even when God seems silent, he is still at work. And that, in the darkest moments, he has placed us in the right place at the right time for a greater purpose. This project has required great effort from our team. Every scene, every word has been crafted with love and passion, because we believe these stories remain alive today. If this movie has touched you, if it has inspired you, share it, give it a like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel, because this is not the end. Very soon, we will release the movie about Nehemiah, where you'll witness how one man rose to restore the walls of Jerusalem, facing threats, conspiracies, and opposition. And before you go, 2 specially chosen videos will appear on the screen. If you want to explore the most striking prophecies of the Bible, don't miss the movie about the apocalypse, where we delve into the events of the end times and their significance for us today. And if you enjoyed this movie, you'll also love the story of Daniel, a man who stayed faithful to God in the midst of a pagan empire, faced lions, and received visions about the end of days. Both are highly recommended, so pick one and continue uncovering with us the mysteries of God's Word. We'll see you in the next video. May God bless you. Amen.